morning, everybody, and welcome to Wednesday's assembly. I hope you are all having a really good week. And I promised you this week that I would explain to you why on Friday the 23rd of April every year, and it's on this Friday, it is St. George's Day. And I promised you I'd tell you a really good story about who St. George was, or the legend of who St. George was and why he was famous and why he's become the patron saint of England. But before I do, I just want to say well done to Year 4, actually, and to Eva, particularly, who was sharing with me today. They've been looking at teachers and leaders in RE, and I think linked to the Sikh religion. You've been looking at the gurus within the Sikh religion, and they were writing a recipe for a good teacher, what makes a good teacher today. I hope I've got some of these things, Eva, and the rest of you in Year 4 in Miss Hall's class. You were thinking about what makes a really good teacher. This is what went into Eva's recipe for a good teacher. 1 cup of kindness. I do try to be really kind. A pinch of control. That's important, isn't it? We all need to follow the rules. A splash of knowledge. And I said to Eva, I think we need more than a splash of knowledge as teachers. I think we need a good splash of knowledge, lots of knowledge to be able to teach you really well. A teaspoon of compliments. Stir the potion or the mixture or the recipe lovingly and leave kindly to set. That's what you need for a good teacher. So I hope your teachers are all following that recipe and being the very best teachers that they can be. So Friday, 23rd, is the St. George's Day, okay? And it's a day when people in England think about St. George, and sometimes there are special events in church because it is linked to religion, St. George's Day, or in the community to kind of celebrate St. George's Day. So basically, every country that makes up the UK, remember we've got 4 countries that make up the UK. We have got England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. You can see them all there. Each of the countries that make up the United Kingdom or the UK has its own patron saint. And so the different ones, you might know them actually. So the patron saint of England is St. George. We're going to talk about him today. The patron saint of Scotland is St. Andrew. I nearly forgot his name then. St. Andrew. The patron saint of Northern Ireland is St. Patrick, and the patron saint of Wales is St. David. And when we talk about these saints in terms of who they are, we're talking about people who are thousands of years, lived thousands of years ago, so they're no longer alive, and they were somebody from the Christian faith who did something extra special to help other people learn about God or to spread the Christian word. And they were so important that they're kind of remembered and they were made into saints. So the patron saint of England is St. George. And there's not a great deal known about St. George. Some of it is known, some of it's factual, and some of it is a bit of a legend, really, in terms of who he was and actually what he did. What we do think, though, is even though he was patron saint of England, we do think he was a Roman soldier. And at that time, Christians were not treated very well by the Romans. And to stand up and say, no, this is what Christian people believe was quite a brave thing to do, because it could have gotten St. George into a lot of trouble. And, you know, he was told, basically, you need to stop being a Christian, you need to stop believing in your Christian God or be killed. And he was really brave and he stayed true to his word and said, no, this is important to me. So his bravery is remembered on St. George's Day. And he also has a really famous story, and we don't know whether this is true or not, children, but we like to enjoy it anyway, around George and the dragon, which shows his bravery. This is the symbol. This is the cross of St. George, that red cross on a white background. And because it's a bit of a myth about St. George and this dragon, we don't know. We don't know whether it happened or not. I've had to find my old Myths and Legends book, here it is, to find the myth of St. George, or the legend of St. George and the dragon, and I will read it to you now. Let's see what he did that made him really brave and really clever. The Dragon and St. George. There are no dragons today, mainly thanks to the knights and heroes who so thoughtlessly rode about the place killing them off. And that's a pity, for dragons must have been astonishing creatures, part snake and part crocodile, with bits of lion, eagle and hawk thrown in for good measure. Not only could they leap into the air and fly, but they could also run at great speed. Not that a dragon would ever run away. Dragons were generally very brave creatures. When they were angry or frightened, smoke would come hissing out of their nostrils, and when things got really rough, flames would rush out of their mouths. But there was no such thing as a cowardly dragon. In the 4th century, when St. George was born, dragons were more feared than admired. It is true that they did have some unsettling habits. They tended to live in dank and nasty caves, often guarding huge piles of treasure, which had almost certainly been stolen from somebody else. They also had an unhealthy appetite for human flesh, and their most favourite food was princesses, although any young woman would do. But they were not the only man-eating animal on the globe. It was just that they got all the bad publicity. Anyway, St. George was the most famous dragon killer of all, which is strange, because guess what? He never actually killed a dragon. The other strange thing is that he was really born in Palestine, even though he later became the patron saint of England. His father was a high-ranking Roman officer in the army, and for a time George too served there as a soldier under the Roman emperors. He became a Christian at a time when Christians were suffering the worst persecution, and he travelled the world spreading the gospel and trying to do Christian good deeds. Now, his encounter with the dragon happened at a small town called Slien. Today, Slien has become known as the city of Beirut, so you'll still hear that name today, and this is where the story begins. The people of Slien had lived in fear of the dragon for many years. It lived in a cave on the edge of a stagnant lagoon a few miles from the town. Now, the vapours from this lagoon would often be carried by the wind into the town, and the people came to believe that the dragon was responsible for the rotten smell that seeped through their streets. So they began to feed the dragon 2 sheep every day in the hope that it would go away. Of course, once the dragon got used to a free lunch at 12 o'clock regularly, it decided to do the opposite and settle down and stay. Perhaps it even decided that the townspeople must be genuinely fond of it because they treated it so well. Certainly, it had no idea that they were afraid. Eventually, the townspeople, who really were rather daft, began to run out of sheep. So a council was called at which all the most important people and the king himself met to decide what they were to do. "Oh, we've given the dragon 1,000 of our sheep," the Minister for External Affairs said, "but it still won't go away." "Oh, perhaps it won't go away," another minister said, "because it doesn't like sheep." "Oh, I agree," said a third minister, "but what are we going to give it instead?" Then the king spoke, and his face was grim. "It is well known," he said, "that dragons like the taste of children. We must give him our children. Once a week we will feed the dragon with our sons and daughters." The result of this was a frightful commotion, which took several minutes to quieten down, and then the king spoke again. "The way we'll do this is we'll have a lottery," he continued. "Every child in the town will be given a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Every week a number will be drawn out of a hat, so it's all fair and square. The child that has that number will be given to the dragon in order to save the town. Is everyone okay with that? There are to be no exceptions. This is the law from now." 3 months passed, during which time no fewer than 12 children were torn from their weeping parents, tied up and left outside the dragon's cave. No one knew what happened, but 7 boys and 5 girls met this terrible end, their flesh picked so cleanly from their bones, and the little skeletons gleamed pure white in the morning light. As for the dragon, it noticed the change in its feeding. It was even a trifle puzzled, but the king had been quite right to say that it would like the taste. In fact, it found children delicious, so it stayed. By the time George arrived, an atmosphere had descended on Slien, more poisonous than any mist that had been blown in from the lagoon. Every Tuesday, the day of the lottery, the streets were so silent that if the town had become a cemetery, you wouldn't have noticed the difference. Few people left their homes, and those that did went about their business with a pale face, their mouths stretched in fear, avoiding each other's eyes. Then, at midday, a bell would ring. Soldiers would knock on the door of a house somewhere in the town. A great cry would break loose. And everywhere, parents would hug their children and thank the gods that their number had not been chosen. St. George came on a Tuesday afternoon, a few hours after one of the lotteries had ended. It didn't take him long to find out what had happened, and when he did find out, he shook his head, half in astonishment, half in despair. Straight away, he went to the palace to find the king, and as he walked into the throne room, he heard the following conversation. "You can't," the king was saying. "I forbid it." But you told us to," one minister replied. "You made the law," a second said. "And you said no exceptions," a third added. But she's a princess, my daughter. She didn't even tell me that she'd been given a number. When I find the idiot that gave her that number, I'll..." "The princess was not given a number," the first minister interrupted. "She took one. She wanted to be like all the other children." "My only child," the king wept. "You can't do it." "It's too late, Your Majesty. It's already done." St. George realised that he had no time to waste. He left the palace without even introducing himself, leapt onto his horse and rode out of the town in the direction of the lagoon. It wasn't difficult to find. The stench from the stagnant water was so strong he could literally follow his nose. The sound of weeping told him that he had found the cave and that he was not too late. The dragon, fortunately, had overslept that day, and the princess was still alive, sitting on the ground with her hands tied behind her back. George got off his horse and walked over to her, and at that precise moment there was a sudden rumble from inside the cave, and the dragon appeared. The dragon was far smaller than George had expected, not a lot larger than his horse. It was bright green, with a peculiar body. Its wings, for example, were far too small to enable it to fly. On one wing there was a pink ring, and on the other a red one. It had two rather squat legs and claws and a long serpent-like neck. But the only really menacing thing about it was its teeth, which were white and very sharp. When the princess saw the dragon, she closed her eyes and waited for the end. But St. George wasn't afraid. "Naughty dragon," he exclaimed, "do you really mean to eat this young girl?" The dragon growled uncertainly. The girl opened her eyes. "Do you not know that eating people is wrong?" St. George continued. "It's bad for dragons, and it's even worse for people." Smoke trickled out of the dragon's nostrils and formed a question mark over its head. Oh, enough of this foolishness. St. George untied the girl and helped her to her feet. Then he took a ribbon from her dress and tied it around the dragon's neck. "Let's go back to Siln and talk this over." He bowed to the princess. "I must say, lady," he said, "you will make a wiser and kinder ruler than your father. That much your actions have shown." Well, you can imagine the uproar in Siln when St. George and the princess returned, leading the dragon on a ribbon. Suffice to say, once they understood what had happened, the entire town became Christians because they believed that St. George was the cleverest and bravest man they'd come across. And so, in fact, did the dragon. A short while later, the king retired from the throne, and his daughter, who had in the meantime married a neighbouring prince, became queen. The two of them ruled very well and wisely for many years, and it would be nice to think that the dragon ended its days in the palace gardens, a friend and a playmate of the queen's children, and even, although perhaps this is asking too much, a vegetarian. So there we go, the story of St. George and the dragon, and one of the reasons why we celebrate St. George's Day on Friday the 23rd of April. Have a good day, everybody. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.